person, you will not, because we've had more extreme weather since these two dates. So the first one, the summer of 1993, if you're from central Iowa, you'll remember that that was the big flood year that we had when Des Moines lost water for about a month. And I happened to live here in Ames that summer, and I remember Vinker Golf Course being there one day and not the next. So 1993 was a very wet summer. Summer of 1988 was the big drought year before the most recent drought year that we had, just recently. So in this figure, the red area is highlighting places that got a lot of rain in 93 and very little in 88. A big difference in summer precipitation. And you can see there's a big red dot over the Midwest, where we again had flooding in 93 and drought in 88. This figure was an effort to model or try to understand with a global climate model what happened during those two summers. Why did we have flooding in 93 and why did we have a drought in 88? And this model did not use any measurement or did not have realistic soil moisture conditions in it. It assumed average conditions. What is soil moisture typically like during the summer in the United States? And you can see that this model, using typical or average soil moisture conditions, did not produce the big red dot. It did not produce the extreme wetness in 93 and extreme dryness in 88. We didn't have soil moisture measurements from satellite back then, but taking recorded precipitation after the fact and making a better guess of what soil moisture was actually like those two summers, this was what the model gave us after using some type of realistic soil moisture. And now the red dot comes back. So we were able to reproduce, at least approximately, why there was extreme wetness in 93 and dryness in 88 if we were able to use a realistic measure of soil moisture. So the argument I'm trying to make here is that, especially in periods of extreme weather, either extreme wetness or extreme dryness, soil moisture appears to be a really important thing for us to know if we're going to understand weather and climate. And it comes back to the fact of how soil moisture mediates, again, this movement of water from Earth's surface to atmosphere, and also this movement of energy from Earth's surface to atmosphere. So soil moisture plays a big role in understanding how weather and climate works. It also, here in Iowa, has another big role, and that's in flooding. And again, 93, the big flood year, but since then we've had, I can't even count how many big flood years we've had since then. So soil moisture is going to be great for Iowans, not only in helping predict weather and climate, but also telling us more about when and where flooding will occur. So I'm hoping that as we develop these measurements of soil moisture from space, we'll be able to make better predictions of weather and climate, because of soil moisture's influence on water movement and energy movement between Earth's surface and atmosphere. Associated periods of drought and extreme wetness, it appears that soil moisture is really critically important in those extreme situations. Of course, if we know more about soil moisture, we'll be able to make better predictions of agricultural productivity, and then also flood severity and extent. That water is not going to soak into the ground, it's going to run off, and that's what we call flooding. All these are really important issues for Iowa, and so I'm really excited to have these types of measurements from space. So some more details about what we're actually getting right now. So again, here's an example of what this data looks like from satellite. This is again the SMOS, or soil moisture ocean salinity satellite. The colors again represent the hot colors are dry soils, low volumetric soil moisture, and the cool colors are wet soils. Soil moisture, again, what it's measuring is what we call soil moisture, or the volumetric water content of about the top 5 centimeters of Earth's surface. The resolution of this data is pretty large at this point. It's about 40 kilometers, or in other words, there's about one measurement for each Iowa county. If you think of a county being about 40 by 40 kilometers here in Iowa, say for Kossuth County. That doesn't sound very good, but when you're talking about global soil moisture data, 40 kilometers by 40 kilometers is really good, having that over the entire globe. So this is not something that's going to be used to tell us about in-field soil moisture variability, for sure, but it's going to be used to tell us more about how the water cycle works and how that affects weather and climate. And then the time resolution, how often we get data from SMOS, is about every other day here in Iowa. So because we're a little bit farther away from the equator than most areas, we get to see SMOS sometimes twice a day, usually more like about every other day, something like that. Okay, a little bit about how SMOS works. SMOS is a microwave remote sensing satellite. It uses microwave radiation to tell us about water stored in soil. So here, to remind you about microwaves, microwaves are longer wavelength radiation. So you start on the left, X-rays are very short wavelengths, then we move into ultraviolet, and then we move into the visible, the light that we can see with our own eyes. As the wavelength gets longer, we move into infrared, and then we hit the radio spectrum, where we have TV, FM, and AM radio, but also microwaves. And this is the same type of radiation that you use in your microwave oven to warm up food, and that's because water has very distinct electrical properties at microwave wavelengths, and in your microwave oven you take advantage of that to shake them up and to warm up your food. In microwave remote sensing, we take advantage of that to be able to see wet soil and to see dry soil. So these microwaves are longer wavelengths than what you're used to thinking about, which would be visible light or infrared light. And the consequence is that because of the long wavelength, we can see through vegetation and into the soil. So microwaves allow us to measure soil moisture underneath vegetation, and of course here in Iowa and the rest of the Midwest we have large changes in vegetation during the year, so that's very important. Some more basic physics about microwaves. So basically SMOS and other satellites like it are just a camera basically in space, but this is a special type of camera that can see microwaves. And what happens is that water molecules in the soil are moving around, and because they're moving around, they emit electromagnetic radiation and specifically microwaves. And these microwaves hit the soil surface, and when the soil is dry, a lot of the radiation gets out. And so SMOS measures a lot of what we call microwave emission when the soil is dry. And when the soil gets wet, we have the water molecules moving around, radiating, but when this radiation hits the soil surface, a lot of that gets reflected back into the soil. Not a lot gets out, and so SMOS measures less microwave emission. So when the Earth's surface looks dark to SMOS, not a lot of radiation being emitted, that means the soil is wet. And when the surface looks bright, that means the soil is dry. Okay, so that's some information on what's happening with SMOS. Now the main thing I want to talk about is how is SMOS performing here in Iowa? To evaluate how a satellite performs is difficult. When you think about it, the SMOS satellite is measuring soil moisture over a whole Iowa county. how am I going to figure out what soil moisture it should be measuring? It's a big area. So what we do may not be the perfect, well, it's really the only realistic method of what we call validation of satellite soil moisture, is to make measurements of soil moisture in place in the ground at several points within what we call the satellite footprint, or the area that the satellite sees. And we have set up a network of in situ soil moisture sensors in a watershed near Ames. It's in the South Fork Iowa River watershed near Eldora. This network is maintained by both the USDA and the University of Iowa and Iowa State University. And there are 20 stations spread throughout the watershed, like the one pictured here. And at each station, there's measurements of precipitation, of course, which is a key thing to know about if we're going to validate soil moisture. But buried into the ground, you can see the hole here, when it was just dug, are soil moisture sensors that are measuring soil moisture in the ground. And the theory is that if we measure in situ soil moisture at enough places, enough, we think about 20 is sufficient, then we can have an estimate of what the true soil moisture should be for that pixel. So I've highlighted, you can see the different locations of these in situ measurements of soil moisture made on the ground, and then I've highlighted 3 SMOS pixel centers, or 3 SMOS pixels that correspond to this area, this watershed of the South Fork of the Iowa River. And here's what we see. So on the horizontal axis here, I have those ground measurements that were made in the South Fork Iowa River watershed. This is volumetric soil moisture, cubic meters per cubic meter, going from 0 to about 0.5. On the vertical axis, I have what SMOS thinks the soil moisture is. And the different colors are those 3 different SMOS pixels that cover that watershed. And what you see is, first, if I draw a best, well, the black line is the one-to-one line, so if the measurements perfectly matched up with SMOS, all the SMOS measurements would lie on that black line. But you can see 3 colored lines that lie below that black line. That means that SMOS is drier than what the network measurements are telling us. So SMOS appears to be too dry so far here in Iowa. And the other thing that you'll notice is that these measurements from SMOS are pretty noisy. So we're trying to figure out why that's the case. As a start, we started thinking about, well, what is SMOS really measuring? SMOS sees this first 5 centimeters of Earth's surface, from the very surface down to about 5 centimeters. Okay? That's what SMOS is actually measuring. These network sensors, on the other hand, are not measuring 0 to 5. They've been buried at 5 centimeters for a good reason. We'd like them to stay in place for a while. Okay? We don't want to have to go out every week and put them back in. So there's a practical reason why these sensors are actually measuring a layer of soil that's a little different than what SMOS is actually seeing. SMOS sees the first 5 centimeters. These network sensors are buried at 5 centimeters and are not really seeing that very top surface. Can that explain the noise and the dryness? So we looked at data from 2013. What I have here is time and day of year on the horizontal axis, soil moisture on the vertical axis here, and on the other side I have precipitation. That's the blue bars here. And the colors are, the red color is the network soil moisture, network change in soil moisture. And the other 3 colors are those 3 SMOS pixels that lie in the South Fork Iowa River watershed. And you can see after precipitation events, the measurements react. We identified 9 periods of precipitation that we're going to look more closely at. The idea thinking that after rain, these two things are going to dry down. The network is going to dry, and SMOS is going to dry. Are they going to dry at the same rate? And the short answer is no. They don't dry at the same rate because they're seeing different amounts of soil moisture. SMOS, right at the surface, these sensors a little bit farther down. So here's one of those time periods. This was in June, July. On the left hand here, I have on top in blue an exponential fit to the network measurement. So this is all 20 sites averaged together over the whole watershed after a rain event, and you can see a nice drying. On the right-hand side in red is SMOS for one of those pixels, and you can see a slightly steeper drop in soil moisture. The network tends to be very clean, while SMOS tends to be pretty noisy here, up and down across that line. And then down here, I have the derivative of the drying rate. So this would be the rate, derivative of soil moisture, so this would be the drying rate. And again, this is the rate of soil drying, cubic meters per day. On the horizontal axis, days after a rain. And in red, SMOS, in blue, these ground measurements. And you can see SMOS dries faster right after the rain than these ground measurements. And when we looked at all 9 periods, we saw the same thing. So what I highlighted on the previous slide was case number 3, where the initial rate of soil drying, cubic meters per day, for the network, here in blue, was about 0.03. While for the 3 SMOS pixels, it was 0.12, 0.10, and 0.10. And if you look at in every case, SMOS dries faster initially after a rain than the network. So the SMOS initial rate of drying is always bigger than the network. And that makes sense because, again, they're measuring 2 different things. SMOS, 0 to 5, the network at 5 centimeters. So we believe that SMOS is noisy because, one reason, simply because of this fact that it's measuring 2 different quantities of water. This quantity of water at the surface that SMOS sees is more variable than the network, what the network is measuring down deeper into the ground. It turns out, though, that that does not explain why SMOS is too dry. You might think that that shallow layer at the surface tends to be a little bit drier than the deeper layer. Doing some modeling work, we found that that's not the case. So we're still trying to figure out why SMOS tends to produce lower soil moisture than what we measure on the ground. We've investigated temperature effects. We know that that's not causing the problem. It's possible that SMOS might be being corrupted by noise from other things that emit microwave radiation, like airport radars. We're looking at that. It might be because SMOS is not using the right soil type for the South Fork of the Iowa River watershed. That's very possible. We're looking into that. And it's also possible that SMOS is not correcting for vegetation in the right way. It's another area that we're going to look at soon. And now we have a new satellite. NASA has launched a satellite called SMAP, Soil Moisture Active Passive, January 31st of this year. It's just up there. It's just getting going. They're still checking things out. But by this summer, we'll have 2 soil moisture satellites in space looking down on us here in the Midwest. And the improvement that we'll see in SMAP is that it's going to give us even finer detail in soil moisture about an Iowa township, about 10 by 10 kilometers, rather than just an Iowa county. So, to summarize, there are these new satellites now that are making soil moisture, the measurements of soil moisture from space. And soil moisture is so important for us here in Iowa because it can tell us more about weather and climate. It can tell us more, we can help us anticipate periods of drought, extreme wetness. It's going to help us estimate agricultural productivity once we get the measurements right, and tell us more about flood severity and extent. And we're working to make sure that these measurements work here in Iowa. Thank you.
We started a couple minutes late. We have people come in, but we'd like to take a couple of questions really quick. We have Chad from Emission.
You talked about the top 5 centimeters and the difference between microwave escape in dry and wet soil. Is it possible that the depth that you're able to see varies based off of how much moisture there is? Like in drier area, you're seeing actually a little deeper and in wetter.
Right. So the question is, does the water content of the soil does the water content of the soil also affect what we call the emitting depth, or how far we see into the soil? And that is very true. It does to some extent. For very, very wet soils, it's going to be maybe a couple centimeters or so. For drier soils, it's going to be more than 5 centimeters. So there is that effect also that changes so much that's actually being measured.
So you can account for some of that potentially by including better soil mapping in the swaths. Like you said, the soil type maybe is one of the ways that you can be able to refine it.
Right. So soil type also influences how the soil type affects this relationship between the emitted radiation and soil moisture. So if we don't have the right soil type, we're not going to get the right answers.
So if the final product, the resolution is 40 meters or 40 kilometers,
Yes.
what does the raw data set look like? And is there some sort of smoothing or averaging algorithms that you can actually look at the raw data more close to your soil moisture points?
So the raw data is going to be the 40-kilometer data. Actually, when SMOS takes a picture, the area it sees on the ground is about 40 by 40 kilometers. Now, SMOS oversamples. In other words, it makes measurements closer together than 40 meters. So there is a way to smooth those things out, but there's still being work done to analyze whether or not that's really giving us a better resolution product or not. It's hard to say.
More of a point cluster instead of a single snapshot for that grid size.
There are points that overlap each other, but how to put them together in the right way, we don't know exactly how to do that. Yeah.
Is SMOS or any other type of satellite imagery able to provide information on salinity?
For sure. That's why it's called soil moisture ocean salinity. It turns out that the salinity of saltiness of the ocean water also affects how much microwave radiation is emitted. So really salty water looks dark and really fresh water looks bright. And they're using that to measure sea surface salinity over the globe right now.
In the soil as well?
In the soil, no, there's not enough variation in salinity compared to all the variation in other parameters to tease that out. Yeah.
One more question in the back of the room.
On your slide that you had reasons why it was likely or unlikely, one of
Yes.
your likely reasons was that it might be looking at the wrong soil type.
Yes.
Is that an automated function of the satellite, or does somebody have to
Yeah.
enter the soil types for each area that this satellite looks at?
Yeah, you have to give the European Space Agency a break because they're the first to do this and they had to do it over the whole globe. All right. So what they did is they took a global soil database to have so much information all over the globe, and we're looking into it right now, and it looks like it's not very good here in Iowa.
Well, that's a fundamental flaw. I mean, how can you expect to get accurate data if you don't know what the soil type is you're looking at?
That's right. The soil type makes a difference. It's not a huge difference, but it is a big difference. So that's why we think it's going to be a major reason why we think that's going to be why it's dry right now. And when we fix that, we think we're going to be good.